Today we're going to make a cider using pears.
Also known as a perry. And it's not something I've made before, but we've had perry before. There was a restaurant that we ordered it one time. And it tastes a lot like an apple cider. It's maybe just a touch on the sweeter side, slightly milder flavor. And we just thought, let's do this. Now, one thing that I do know is maybe the pears that we can buy in our store aren't the right kind of pears for making cider. So we have a backup plan for that, and it's coming. You'll see it. Because generally, like I know when you make apple cider, you want a mixture of apples, and a lot of people actually prefer crab apples, the little teeny tiny things. So we used an eating pear that you would just buy, okay? So
These are Bosc.
they're Bosc pears. So we have 5 pounds of pears here, which is probably not going to be enough to make a full gallon of juice, but we'll get to that. First, we need to process some pears. So I just know I don't really want the stem, so I'm going to cut that off and then throw that in the garbage bowl. And then I'll cut this in half, and then, see, they don't have much of a core in them, so I'm not really going to worry. If I see seeds, I want to pop those out. And I'm basically just going to chop it up into a couple of pieces like that. And because I don't actually have one of those fancy apple chipper things, I do have a blender, so I'm going to put it in the blender. By the way, these smell awesome. We did wash these pears, okay? And somebody will ask why we're not going to use Camden tablets. And here's why. First, I don't like adding sulfites to things. Now, I know there's sulfites naturally occurring in a lot of foods and all that, but you know what? I don't need to add more. Second, the main reason for doing that is to kill off wild yeast. Now, that is an actual concern. However, most wild yeast really aren't all that quick to start fermenting things. So we're going to be using a strong yeast. I'm actually going to be using champagne yeast. I know what you're thinking. I've talked about champagne yeast before, but you know what? It's okay. You can totally use champagne yeast as long as you know why you're using champagne yeast. In this case, I'm using it to overpower any potential wild yeast that could be in there.
We wanted our fermentation to start up quickly and go through thoroughly, and that's why we chose champagne yeast.
This shouldn't be a very high ABV either. And once fermentation starts, generally speaking, any undesirable things that might have tried to grow in there really can't. Molds and things like that really can't grow in a non-oxygen environment. So I'm not as concerned once that yeast kicks in. Thus, use a strong yeast. Then you don't have to worry at all. It's probably going to take me a while. See you in a bit. So I'm going to have to work in batches simply because my blender's pitcher just isn't quite big enough to hold all of it at once. Now, once it's all blended up, it probably could. And you don't have to use a red blender, but if you have one, that's extra points. Just saying. So can I have the lid? Okay, I will just warn you, this thing is loud. It's going to sound like a jet engine taking off because our microphone is right there. I will try to adjust the volume as this goes.
So for your benefit, we will not be speaking while we're blending.
I realized really quickly that it's just not going to blend all on its own. There's not a lot of liquid in here. I don't want to add more because we actually have to juice this afterwards. I already took the cap off. It's over there. See? Got her. So I'm just going to use the billy club, also known as the tamper or the pusher or whatever they call it. I like to call it a billy club because it looks like a billy club. But anyway, so here we go. Now, while I transfer this over, a word about sanitization of these things. If you're concerned about it, you can freeze those pears, okay? That will actually kill off most of the stuff that's going to be a problem. It won't really kill the wild yeast, but it'll make them dormant enough that they probably won't be an issue. I don't worry about those kind of things as much, especially since I know this is only going to take a couple of days to ferment, like literally 4 or 5 days. So most of those things really aren't going to take hold in that kind of time either, which is another advantage to a lower ABV. So in this exact brew, in this exact method, using this exact yeast, it's not as big of a problem. Now, I know a lot of people, when they make apple cider, they tend to definitely make sure to clean and pasteurize and everything like that. And you can cook these pears if you really want to. You can totally do that. I wanted to make a nice simple process, and this might end up being, you know, somewhere in the 3 to 5% range. It might be a little bit higher, but it's probably going to be somewhere in that range. So it's going to ferment so fast. I'm not really all that concerned about contaminants. All right, so this is our juice press that I actually bought to make cheese. And I don't think I've even used it for... I've used it for...
I think we did grapes or something.
I pressed cheese with it once, I think. I may have.
I don't remember.
I don't know. I might have done yogurt in it, actually. But anyway, I'm taking a brew bag and I'm putting it into the bowl of this thing. Totally wrong use of it, but this way I double it up. You can just use cheesecloth if you want to. The brew bag was just easier to reach. And I'm just going to pour in a bunch of the mash. Oh, look at that. It all goes in at once.
Do you need a spatula?
Yes. Now, what I want to be careful of is juice is going to start coming out of this tube. So while I hold the tube, Derek is going to scoop it out of the pitcher. Teamwork. It's a wonderful thing. I didn't think it was all going to fit in there. I'm just going to give it a little pat down on the table there and then push this into there. And then she's going to hold a pitcher. You can't really see it. Let me show you guys. Let me show you guys what we're working with here. Okay, so we got the bag with all the mash in it right here, right? That goes down to this tube, which is just behind this basket here, and that goes into the pitcher. The idea is that right there, as we turn it, goes into the basket, which will just adjust the position a little bit, and it squeezes down the mash, pushing out the liquid into the pitcher. Okay, so now we crank it. There's already juice coming out. It's pretty awesome. You hear that?
Do we need a juice cam?
Yeah, and you just want to be careful. You don't want it to come up over the top of the plunger. So give it a minute. If it starts to do that, just wait. It'll eventually die down. And you can even back off a little bit if you need to, like that. See? Then it stops coming out. I'll push down again. You're going to get some coming over the top, and it's just going to happen. It's okay. This is going to take a while. See when we're done. Okay. We get asked all the time, how come you guys never do whole fruit fermentations? And this is why. 5 pounds of fruit yielded that much juice. It's only about 2 cups. I knew this was going to happen. I knew we were going to get barely any out of it. And the answer is use like 50 pounds, right? Or do this. Juice. So what we're going to do, that's the backup plan. We're going to make a Perry using pear juice and our fresh juice. Now, could we have cut up the pears and thrown them in there? Sure. There's a million different ways that this could be done. I actually wanted to see how much more complicated it would be to do the pressing, and it's just not worth it. If you, however, do have a pear tree or access to fresh pears, absolutely do this. You're going to get the best product possible. But I will say this, using juice is easier. Is it cheating? I don't know. But you're still making cider, and that's the key thing. Now, this juice here, just so you know, juice from ripe, whole, organic pears, ascorbic acid. That's it. The ascorbic acid is to maintain color. That's it. So there's not much in here. And there's no potassium sorbate. There's no sulfites in here. So this stuff is really just as good as that stuff when you really think about it, okay? Might be a little bit older, but it's vacuum sealed, all that. It's from organic pears. These probably, well, they were organic pears. We chose the organic ones. So same difference. I hear a lot of people say this with cider. They say, I'm making turbo cider. Okay, what's turbo cider, first off? I know a lot of people call using juice to make cider turbo cider. And I hear people say, I'm making wine when they talk about like our sweet red wine made from juice. Well, here's the thing. If you start with a whole fruit, you have to go through all this to get this, or you buy a bottle of this.
The way I see it, the only difference between this and this is a bunch of frustration.
Yep. It's not fun. It's not simple. It's messy. It's clunky. You got to buy this big piece of equipment that actually doesn't even hold all that much. So if we were to do this right, we'd need to fill this 6 or 7 times. It's an all-day process to make 1 gallon of juice. Not worth it. That's why we do juices. By the way, this wasn't meant to be a full-on rant, this whole video, but I just wanted to point out this is why we don't do a lot of whole fruit. But I do like showing you the process of how to do it.
Now, an alternative idea is to skip this monstrosity altogether and go straight from the chopped fruit to the blended fruit, put that muck in a bag, and put it in a wide mouth fermenter.
You can absolutely do that, and it will extract a lot of the fruit and juices from that. You're still going to need water or something, so it's still a combination hybrid method, but today we're not doing it that way, and we are done with this thing, so we're going to get it out of the way and be right back. So now that we're at this point, a couple things that I'd like to do is I want to take readings. Now, these are more for my own information than for any other reason, because once these are mixed together, we'll get its own reading of the whole thing. But I'm really curious, how does that compare to that for sugar content? So I'm going to take a quick reading from our pitcher. Oops!
Oh, that juice that we worked so hard to get.
Oops! Pretty much what I guessed. 1.050 on the nose. That's pretty much what you can expect from most bottled juices, especially ones that don't have added sugars. If they have added sugars, it can be higher than that. So now I want to take one from this, and I'm shaking it up real good. So any sediment, any stuff that was stuck in the bottom is all mixed through, because that's, you know, nutrient for your yeast. Did I get any on you?
No, I just reacted because I saw liquid coming out.
It wasn't even all that much, but it looked bad.
That blob and that blob.
I cannot be trusted with equipment. That can go back into turbos. 1.050. So they are identical for sugar content. And that's kind of what I was getting at, is there's really not much advantage to whole fruit unless that's what you have. So let me say that. And now I'm just going to start pouring stuff into here. This is going to be our fermenter. And it doesn't matter. You can add oxygen at this point. I will take another reading in a little while.
What, is this resanitized?
You don't have to.
Can I put it over here?
Sure, as long as I don't knock it over, which I'm gonna. So I do notice that the fresh stuff is a little bit darker in color than the Nudsons. Now, Nudsons is a really, really high quality version of juice, okay? There might be a cost difference too, like doing it juice-wise might cost a little bit more than doing whole pears, but you can get this stuff year-round. Can you get fresh pears year-round? One down. No, that's perfect. So all in all, 3 quarts of this stuff and our fresh juice is enough. Which goes to show that when you're making a gallon, you're really not even making a gallon, because that was like, I don't know, a couple cups, maybe not even half a quart, you know, so it was less than a pint. So yeah, see? So now I don't even have to take a reading because I know they're both 1.050. So mixed together, they're going to be 1.050. Makes math a lot easier for me. Okay, but some things still need to happen. Like we need to add yeast. I need to aerate it. So next step is add yeast. Now, I said I'm going to use champagne yeast. I'm actually using Red Star Premier Blanc yeast. Now, this is considered a champagne yeast. It's actually a white wine yeast. I consider ciders along the lines of a white wine. So it should actually work really, really well. Another one of those packets that you have to cut open. Attention yeast manufacturers. Please, please put your yeast in a package that you can actually tear open with your fingers, because why do I need to do this? Now, my usual rule of thumb for yeast is half a packet up to 3 gallons, full packet over 3 gallons. 3 gallons, do whatever you want, within reason. But today, because I do want to overpower anything that might have been growing in here, I'm going to use a whole packet. Now, see, there's another advantage to using juice over whole fruit. That juice was clean and sterile, because otherwise it would have exploded in the bottle if there was things in there. So that's another advantage. We do have a little bit of natural juices in here, so I like to be on the safe side. So we're going to use a whole packet. You have to thwack your yeast. It's a moral imperative. And there's always a few grains that don't come out. And I'm going to use a solid bung, also known as my thumb saver bung. And you'll see why. See, you put your thumb over it. And I want to shake the bejesus out of this. Now, what do I mean by shake the bejesus? First, you want all the bejesus out of the must. Second, what I'm actually doing is oxygenating and mixing that yeast throughout. It's not as important to mix the yeast, but it's really important to oxygenate it. In the early stages of fermentation, when the yeast are building a colony, they utilize oxygen to reproduce and build that colony. Once that's gone, all the oxygen is gone, that's when they start consuming the sugars and producing CO2 and alcohol. So you want to give them a good amount of oxygen. It's also a really good arm workout. The color will actually change. It'll get lighter. And sometimes you'll build up some pressure. That's why I was releasing it. Usually a few minutes is all you really need. I mean, you can oxygenate a lot more. Some people use like air stones from their fish tank. Don't use the one right out of your fish tank. Get one specifically for it that you sterilize and make sure it's clean. I've heard some horror stories, but you can do that if you really want to. I don't get that crazy about it. Brewing should be simple. By the way, if you hear a cat screaming in the background, that is Gizmo, our first. She wants to play, she wants attention, and for some reason all of our cats seem to freak out every single time they see this setup happen. What do we do now? We put a lid on it. We put an airlock on it. This is an airlock. There are a lot of different kinds of airlocks out there, and you can even just use a piece of tubing going into a mason jar of water. Perfectly fine. Please don't use a balloon. We actually have a video on that. There's a lot of reasons not to. I'd rather see you put a loose cap on there than actually use a balloon. But please, if you have any way at all to make or get an airlock type of device, please do that. Because what it does is it's insurance, okay? As pressure builds in here from the CO2 that's produced by the yeast, it'll go up this tube, down this tube, and push the liquid all the way to the other side, to this side. Then it'll bubble out. And, it's great entertainment too. I mean, have your kids watch. I mean, they'll sit there for hours like this. But it's also a good indicator that something is occurring. Now, it's not a good indicator that fermentation is done because degassing will happen for weeks afterwards. But once it starts to really slow down or you see neutral pressure, that means they're the same height. That's usually a pretty good indicator that it's time to take your first check, which that'll be in part 2 of this video. But for now, what are we going to do with this?
We're going to let it sit. And what we're actually doing is waiting for it to show signs that it's starting fermentation. And as soon as that happens, we're going to share it with you.
So it's been about 2 hours, and we obviously have some activity. It's going a little bit slow, of course, because as soon as I start the camera, it never actually goes fast enough. But let me talk about, there it goes, right? So let me talk a little bit about this. There's plenty of bubbles in the bottle itself, but let me get a closer look.
So you can see there's activity going on in the airlock. I was counting a bubble nearly every 5 seconds. It's going to make a liar out of me right now, but here comes one. See? And it's doing the little cluster bubble thing.
Yeah, it's not just doing one bubble at a time, which is pretty cool.
But down here is where things get interesting. You can see the foam on the top, but then just below the top, there is some clumping of the yeast.
Pulp. I think that's pulp too.
There could be pulp too, but I'm thinking because we put a full packet in there, and it's extra foamy because you can see all the bubbles in that liquid area at the top.
There's bubbles being trapped in there.
Yeah. So we got some serious activity going on. We have a pretty opaque, opaque would be the word, liquid here. So we're not really able to see much of the lava lamp, as we like to call it.
Yeah, you really can't see it. I'm sure there's something going on in there.
But this whole strata on the top is
like a good inch thick.
Very thick and full of bubbles and all sorts of stuff.
Now, something that we've talked about doing, and I don't do it as much as I used to, is the swirl. Some people have taken it way too far. Let me just say that.
Did they
It's not
over
a
swirl the swirl?
well, they make it like you absolutely must do it or else you have to throw it away. Someone actually said, I just learned that you're supposed to swirl this for the first few days, so I dumped it out.
No.
Really? Don't do that. Seriously, don't dump it out. You only dump it when it's like poisonous to human consumption, pretty much. So here is how you do a swirl. And in a second, I'll go over when and how much. And I just literally will do like this. Just give it a swirl, kind of like what I do in the glass when I'm taking a taste. Now, sometimes it'll do a negative pressure thing because you created a vortex that could create a little bit of a vacuum in there. But this time it didn't. I also got rid of all the really cool foam. But don't worry, it'll be back.
It'll be back.
And it'll bring its friends. Anyway, so when do you do the swirl? Pretty much the first day. If you want to, a couple times, there's no harm. Keep that yeast moving around in case anything settled to the bottom. For the first 4 or 5 days, not really a problem. Notice I didn't take the lid off or anything like that. You don't take the lid off and stir it around with a spoon. That's not a good idea. After about the first 4 or 5 days, I generally don't. Some people were like, oh, I have to swirl it for like a month. No, you don't have to do that. And you don't even have to swirl it at all. It's not a requirement. It's not necessarily. What it does is it just gets a little bit of the early gases out, giving the yeast a little easier time to get going, and it keeps everything in suspension. It might even get a little bit more oxygenation in there in the first 24 to 48 hours. It's a minor thing, okay? If you didn't do it, it's not the end of the world, so I don't want anybody being all worried about it. But that is probably the number one question that I've gotten in the past month. I don't know why all of a sudden people are losing their mind over swirling their brew. But anyway, this is going to ferment for probably a week to 10 days, maybe a little bit longer. We'll be back with an update. If you like this video, look up. There's another one up there. You might like that one too.